about to witness the Halloween Study 2012, the final assignment requirement for the Biostatistics Nursing 576 class taught by Dr. Vicki Krenz. Trick-or-treating has its roots back 2,000 years during the ancient Celtic festival called Samhain, which means summer's end. On October 31st, the Lord of Death, Samhain, calls together all of the souls that had died during the year, and as they travel to the afterlife, they mingle with the living. Trick-or-treating is a modern Halloween tradition that evolved from the practice of distributing soul cakes to beggars during Samhain in return for their promise to pray for the family's dead relatives. This practice, referred to as going a-souling, was eventually taken up by children who would visit the houses in their neighborhood and be given ale, food, and money. To avoid recognition by spirits, villagers would wear masks and ghoulish costumes after dark, so that the spirits of the dead would think they were one of their own and pass them by without stirring up any trouble. The United States Census Bureau estimates that 40 million kids participate in the annual tradition of trick-or-treating on Halloween. A national survey of parents with children's ages 12 and under, 73% report that their children go trick-or-treating door to door, 75% have never let their child go without adult supervision, and 15% express fears regarding child abductions. In 2006, California enacted curfew policies which prohibit registered sex offenders from going out or opening their doors on Halloween. Nevertheless, the allure of candy, costumes, and the social experience that Halloween offers inspires the average person to spend nearly $80 on decorations, costumes, and candy, which is up from $72.31 spent last year, with total Halloween spending expected to reach $8 billion in 2012. The purpose of the Halloween study was to determine if there's a costume preference in existence among Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters based on total population and gender. In addition, candy preference, social attributes of trick-or-treaters with respect to group versus singleton patterns, presence or absence of parent, and gender prevalence were identified. I observed 76 Halloween trick-or-treaters at my home in the Midtown section of Palo Alto. Midtown is a family-friendly community located close to neighborhood amenities, a couple of parks, and an abundance of churches and temples. Using a single sample design, I conducted an observational study. Variables included costumes worn, gender, age, group size, presence of parents, and candy selection based on 4 popular options. A data collection tool was developed using the Dr. Krenz smoke-free local tribal casino survey format provided to us during our August 2012 intensive in Fresno. Data entry and analysis will be conducted using SPSS for Windows version 20, and the chi-square goodness of fit and chi-square test of independence tested my statistical significance in this study. Treaters at my door were provided with a menu of available candy selections, and I posted those on the front of the door, invited them to cross the threshold, taking a couple of steps and selecting their candy of choice, which was assembled in 4 beautiful containers on a table 30 inches high. In every instance, trick-or-treaters selected their candy. I actually told them, this year I'm not giving out candy, this year I'm letting my trick-or-treaters pick their candy. Each treater was asked their age, which they had no trouble providing because I was giving them candy, and for a younger child, a parent responded to the question. Here is a sample, actually the exact photograph of what I had posted on the front door. And here is my actual setup near my threshold. Taking 2 steps, you would walk in and choose from one of these 4 bowls your favorite Halloween candy. This is the data collection tool that I utilized to collect my data during the study, and as you can recall from our intensive, it looks a whole lot like what Dr. Krenz gave us. The limitations of the study. Now, random samples, randomization, and blinding were not possible in my study, and as a result, inferential statistical techniques were not used to analyze data. With the exception of age, which provides ratio data, all of my other data are categorical. Non-parametric tests were utilized in data analysis because they test hypotheses that do not require normal distributions or variance assumptions about my Halloween population. And due to the large number of costumes represented by trick-or-treaters, costumes were placed into categories that I personally designated. So here's my first hypothesis about costumes. My null hypothesis is that costume categories observed in 76 Halloween trick-or-treaters in Palo Alto indicate no costume preference, and my alternative hypothesis is that costume categories observed in 76 Halloween trick-or-treaters in Palo Alto do indicate costume preference. And I created a frequency distribution of all costumes in terms of their appearance as they relate to the categories that I selected. As you can see from the frequency distribution, no costume, round or square, animal, superhero, athlete, evil, movie character, and wings, crowns, and tutus were the representatives of my categories. Of course, wings, crowns, and tutus represent angels, princesses, and ballerinas. Here is the formatted frequency distribution for my Halloween costumes, and as you can see, the most prevalent costumes were definitely animal, superhero, evil, and movie character. I ran a chi-square goodness of fit test, and as a result, I accepted the null hypothesis that costume preference is not indicated in Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters. The difference is not statistically significant at the 0.05 level, and my chi-square was 9.895 with 1 degree. As a result of the large number of costumes selected by my population, there was no possibility that costume preference could be indicated in this particular study. Next, I moved on to males, and my null hypothesis is that male costume categories observed in the trick-or-treaters indicated no preference, and my alternative hypothesis was that male costume categories in the 36 males that did come trick-or-treating to my door indicated costume preference. Here's the frequency distribution, and as you can see, males definitely prefer superhero, athlete, and evil costumes. I formatted my frequency distribution for male Halloween costumes based on my output, and as you can see, the greatest number of costumes represented were once again superheroes, athletes, and evil, with superheroes by far the largest number of costumes that were represented in the study. So using SPSS, I ran a chi-square goodness of fit test, and looking at the results, I rejected the null hypothesis that costume preference is not indicated in female Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters. As you can see, the difference is definitely statistically significant at the 0.05 level, with chi-square being 23.000 and 7 degrees of freedom. Females definitely had a preference for certain types of costumes, with the most prevalent costumes being animal, wings, halos, and tutus, and movie characters. So in general, here are my findings from the first part of this study. Costume preference is observed in Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters based on gender. Males definitely prefer superhero, evil, and athlete costumes, whereas females prefer movie character, animal, and wings, crowns, and tutu costumes, which are categorized to represent princesses, Disney princesses, ballerinas when they appeared, and angels. So as mentioned earlier, there was a large consumer survey done earlier in the year, in September 2012, where parents of Halloween trick-or-treaters were surveyed to determine what they knew about what their child would be wearing for Halloween. So the population and sample size, my population and the national population, was compared using identical categories. The population category Other, which was represented in the national study, did not exist in my population, and so there will be no comparison, as you will see coming up. So here's a snapshot of what the Big Insight Monthly Consumer Survey looked like, and as you can see, there were quite a number of different types of costumes reported that children would be wearing on Halloween, but down near the bottom there will be 31.8% in the Other category. This is an example of how I classified my costumes. So as I mentioned earlier, I had to do this because there were so many different types of costumes in each category, and for the purposes of running statistics, it was necessary to classify costumes based on these 8 categories. So up on top, you'll see the various costumes representing the population in each of these 8 categories, and below is my sample population with the various types of costumes that came to my door that were represented in the 8 categories. In an attempt to draw a comparison between the population and Palo Alto costumes, I was unable to do so. The national study and the Palo Alto study could not be compared due to the large degree of difference among the different types of costumes presented, and in addition, the 31.8% other category in the national study prohibited me from doing any types of statistical analysis. Findings in the Halloween costume study indicate that costume categories and unique costume types were highly represented in the Big Insight poll. Nearly 1/3 of the reported percentages were less than 1%, and 31.8% of costumes were identified as other. And I did not have other in my population, so it created an inability for me to compare them. But in general, in an attempt to create a comparative study, I did organize the reported 32 costume types from the national poll using my categories. The category of other unfortunately prohibited me from using the chi-square goodness of fit test for the population. In general, Big Insight is a predictive poll conducted in early September and not an actual count of observed costumes. Parents may not be the best resource for determining what their children will wear on Halloween, and Big Insight brags about the multiple resources it uses to report their data with a margin of error of plus or minus 1%, and the basis for their claim is really unsupported by actual data collected post-Halloween. I went on to do hypothesis testing for candy selection. The null hypothesis would be that Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters demonstrated no candy preference, where the alternative hypothesis would be that they would demonstrate candy preference when selecting candy on Halloween. A chi-square goodness of fit test for Halloween candy was selected, and I was able to reject the null hypothesis that there was candy preference for Halloween trick-or-treaters in Palo Alto. The difference is statistically significant at the 0.001 level, with chi-square being 41.158 and the degree of freedom being 3. My findings were that Tootsie Pops with an N of 40 were favored over peanut M&Ms, Paydays, and Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Based on the chi-square goodness of fit test, the difference was statistically significant, as I reported earlier, and thus most trick-or-treaters prefer Tootsie Pops as their candy of choice on Halloween. My study is so intriguing that I went on to do hypothesis testing for accompanied by parent, with the null hypothesis being there was no relationship between Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters and presence of parent, and the alternative hypothesis being that there was a relationship between Palo Alto trick-or-treater age and presence of parent. A chi-square test of independence was used in this particular comparative study, and I was able to reject the null hypothesis that there was no relationship between Palo Alto trick-or-treater age and presence of parents. The relationship between age and presence of parent is statistically significant at the 0.001 level, with a chi-square of 33.053 and 3 degrees of freedom. Findings in this study indicate that there is a relationship between presence of parents and age of Palo Alto Halloween trick-or-treaters. 84% of children ages 12 and under are accompanied by parents, a statistic that is higher than the 75% reported national average. As you see in front of you, here are the references for my study. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to my Halloween Study 2012, with thanks to Dr. Krenz for addressing my concerns and questions about this particular study.